dear guests. Welcome to our webinar, 4 scenarios for Belarus by the end of 2023. We had actually over 150 registrations for this webinar, so thank you so much for this interest. And this is once again for me a sign of the fact that Belarus and the future of Belarus is politically seen as still important in Europe. We have representatives from the European Union that registered, and also German Foreign Ministry, and representatives of the political structures of other countries, think tanks, experts, Belarusian democratic forces, and also media. So welcome once again. Dear guests, the dependence of the Belarusian regime on Russia has significantly increased after the post-electoral protest 2020, but also especially after the start of the Russian full-scale war against Ukraine last year. And both Belarusian democratic forces and international experts point to the increased danger for the Belarusian sovereignty, even in the near future. Also, the developments of Belarus or around Belarus will play a crucial role for security situation and stability in Eastern Europe and in Europe as a whole. And even though it seems like Belarus almost disappeared from the political agenda in Europe, but also internationally, after February last year, since there is a need for both for Belarusian actors and international actors, both for expert circles and politicians, to develop probable short-term narratives for Belarus. This is exactly what our experts have been doing till now. So between February and April this year, we gathered 15 excellent experts from 8 different countries. Experts who are focusing on Belarus, Eastern Europe, international relations, security, and so on. And they worked out 4 possible scenarios for Belarus by the end of this year. Our research question for this paper, for this scenario paper, is as follows. What will the Belarusian sovereignty look like by the end of 2023? Now I will share a scenario compass with you so that we have also a visual part of this introduction. In such a way you will understand better how the drivers are connected to each other. So we have, or experts decided to have 2 key drivers that are crucial for the Belarusian sovereignty and at the same time might be extremely unpredictable. That's why we have here both extreme pluses and extreme minuses. So the first key driver is the Russian pressure on Belarus. You can see it, it's a vertical line here. And it has 2 extremes. One is a plus, which means for our scenario paper that Russia actually decides de facto to annex Belarus. And with a minus, with a low pressure coming from Russia, we mean that Russia cannot exert any pressure on Belarus. It wants to, but it is not capable of. Those are 2 extremes on the vertical side, on the Russian pressure. And the second driver is resilience of Belarus. You see it here in a horizontal line. High level of resilience of Belarus would basically mean the reaction of Belarusian authorities, how they react on the Russian pressure. They decide to start a kind of a national dialogue with the Belarusian society. This would be the high resilience of Belarus for this paper. And the low level of resilience would mean that Belarusian authorities, elites, actually prone to cooperate more with the Russian elites as with the Belarusian society. That's how the interplay of these 2 drivers brings us to 4 different scenarios that we will be discussing today. Now shortly about the purpose of this paper. This paper is actually have been not made to predict the most probable scenarios of the future, but instead of reproducing the past trends, as it often happens in the expert circle, so to say, our experts focused on key events that might lead to a qualitative change of the current situation. Why do we need it? So that we are ready for most unexpected threats and that we can initiate corresponding political thinking and action. And frankly speaking, when I think about our last, or actually the first policy paper, scenario paper, it was published in November 2021. None of the experts could have thought of such black swans or unpredictable events as Russian bombs falling on Kiev already in February 2022, which means to me that in the current situation, there is almost nothing that is unimaginable anymore. That was also important during our work with the experts. Dear guests, this policy paper was produced within the international project European Network for Belarus. We do it in cooperation with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation Office of Belarus. The project is coordinated in Germany by organization Austausch and is implemented with six partner organizations operating in Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, and Germany. And it is financed by the German Foreign Ministry and the German Marshall Fund of the United States. My name is Olga Grindova. I will be moderating this discussion today. And before we come to it, just some technical issues for you to know. This discussion is being recorded and will be published afterwards. We also have journalists registered, so that would mean that the voices could be recorded by journalists to be used afterwards for the media material. And during the discussion session, you will have the possibility to ask your question with a voice. We will not show videos, and there is no possibility to ask the question here in the Q&A session. Our plan is as follows. First, we'll hear the introduction. Well, the 4 scenarios will be introduced, 5 minutes for each scenario. You see all of them here. Then we will make a short summary of the main insights that experts, so to say, took out of the scenarios while working on them. After that, we'll come to the policy recommendations based on scenarios, policy recommendations for different aim groups, for different policy actors. And finally, we will have time for discussion with the public. So, dear guests, we will start the presentation of scenarios now. Once again, here is the scenario compass, and we will ask each expert to make a short introduction of own scenario, starting with the timeline, which would mean how did we get there, what events did we need to come to extreme plus or extreme minus by the end of the year, did we need any black swans? Black swans are extremely unpredictable events that become a game changer in our scenario paper. Then shortly introduce the war factor. With the war factor, we mean the developments of the war in Ukraine, whether it has some influence on the Belarusian, the state of Belarusian sovereignty, and all of 4 scenarios do have a war factor in our work. And finally, very shortly introduce the areas of applications, maybe in 2 or 3 sentences, which would mean what does each scenario mean for Belarus relations with the EU, with Russia, with Ukraine, but also what does it mean for Belarusian democratic forces, civil society, and the regime of Belarus. Okay, we'll start with the scenario of Russian protectorate. It is here, and you can see that in this scenario, the level of Russian pressure is very high, and at the same time, the level of the Belarusian resilience is very low, which is, so to say, in this very paper, the most sad scenario according to our drivers. It is also the only one scenario that doesn't have any black swans, which could mean that this scenario just means, the prolongation of the status quo today. If the developments will go further the way they do today, we can find ourselves soon in a scenario that is called Russian protectorate. I would ask Tatiana Chulitskaya to represent this scenario. Tatiana, thank you that you agreed to do it for the group you worked with. Tatiana is working at the Vilnius University and Manchester Metropolitan University, correspondently in Lithuania and the United Kingdom. Dear Tatiana, please tell us more about this scenario, and you will have 5 minutes for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Olga. I'm honored and privileged to be a part of this group and a part of this discussion today. I'll start with some brief explanation why we call this scenario itself as a protectorate. As we know from international relations, protectorate means the relationships, unequal relationships between two states, one of which exercises some decisive control over the other. So our idea was that indeed, without any black swans, the developments of the current Belarusian situation might be as to become, or Belarus become a part of Russia or a part of its protectorate. What are the main developments within this scenario? So we expect that war in Ukraine, it's a kind of developing not in favor of Russia. And in order to compensate it, Russia develops a proposal from which Belarusian authorities cannot refuse, and to develop even deeper integration than it has with Belarus now. So after these new plans are introduced at the beginning in secret, and then not in secret, we see that Belarusian society is not in favor of these developments. However, it's not enforced to somehow to struggle with it. It's trying. I mean, there are some actions, some dissatisfaction. There might be some demonstrations, but in general, because of repression and because of really like strict interference of Belarusian Siloviki, society is unfortunately suppressed by the government. So we expect that in July, Russia developed a treaty on advanced integration within the union state of Russia and Belarus. And the treaty will introduce some common defense space. It also creates an additional grounds for Russian military bases in Belarus. Also, there will be provision of control over different security-related issues, but also over security-related ministries. So important part of this scenario is that Russia is developing this institutional control on some of the important Belarusian spheres, in particular on foreign affairs, but also in the sphere of economy. I'll say several words later about it. So, like seeing this development, the Western capitals, the Western democratic governments, they do not recognize the decision of this deeper integration and creation of protectorate, and they consider it as illegitimate. However, the Western countries have limited tools how to act against it, and what they do, they announce a new round of sanctions against Belarus, and also they synchronize, so they put in parallel sanctions policy against Russia and Belarus. Also, we see some reshaping of ministries in Belarus, and we will see common foreign ministry, also some developments in Ministry of Internal Affairs and Defense, but on the level of the National Bank, Ministry of Economy and Ministry of Finance, which have always been a kind of so-called liberal bloc within Belarusian government, they will also be more controlled by Russia, and we also expect that at some point common currency as a Russian ruble with just one emission center in Moscow will be introduced. When it comes to Ukraine, it's very interesting here that we expect that within this scenario, official Kyiv might cut off all diplomatic relations and channels of communication with the Belarusian government and Lukashenko in particular. So there might be new developments. And when it comes to democratic forces, they will be more cooperating with the West, with Ukraine. They will have some sympathies from Belarusian society and Belarusian civil society. However, unfortunately, this scenario means like less resilience of Belarusian society society and also less resilience of Belarusian democratic forces. So in spite of the Western support, it won't have like a lot of leverages and linkages with Belarusian society. We're still on the ground. And the very last sentence from my side, within this scenario, we also expect a further migration wave from Belarus. So these very unfavorable developments for society will mean that civil society organization and organized civil society might be further destroyed, and people who can afford themselves economically to leave the country will leave the country. I will stop here and I will be happy to answer your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana, perfectly within 5 minutes. Thank you for presenting this quite sad scenario, and as some experts believe also kind of most realistic one, unfortunately, within our scenario paper. But let's move further. We still have 3 more scenarios. Now we are here. Now we are here at the scenario sovereignty by default. All the other scenarios had a bit more needed a bit more fantasy from experts to come to extreme pluses and minuses. We have black swans there, at least one black swan in this scenario. And what do we see here? We combine the low level of Russian pressure. How is it even possible that in the current situation, Russia is somehow not capable of exerting pressure on Belarus, and at the same time, the low level of resilience coming from the Belarusian elites who are not cooperating with the Belarusian society. Dear Adam, we would like to ask you, as a representative of your scenario group, how did you make it possible to see both minuses by the end of the year? So we have Adam Reichert with us, who is an expert from Poland, and exactly from the Jan Nowak Jeżorański College of Eastern Europe, or known as KEF in Poland. Adam Reichert is also our project partner within this project. So dear Adam, the floor is yours. You also have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Olga, and hello everybody. Indeed, this was a very difficult scenario to develop because it's a unique situation where we have both low pressure coming from Russia, but at the same time like a low resilience of the elite to do anything that would go into a different path. So it was really, I think, difficult. We got a bit creative. I'll briefly go through our scenario for you to understand how it looks and what we decided that could bring the Belarus to this scenario for the rest of this year. So basically, by the end of 2023, we see that in this scenario, while there's this low pressure and low resilience, Belarus does come out with more sovereignty than it had in the beginning of the year. This is basically not related to any sort of inspiration or positive developments, but rather it's largely tied to what we see as the result of military success in Ukraine, which is related to the previous scenario, which had a similar external development, but also the fact that Moscow tries to meddle into the Belarusian affairs and fails. And I will get to that in a moment because that is our black swan. So basically, to start, I mean, the war factor kicks off our timeline in this scenario. We have the summer offensive. We see the Ukrainian summer offensive in the war becomes quite successful, more successful than some have actually expected. And this leads the Russian army to really start with having forced withdraw, even disintegrating in some aspects, and the Kremlin and Putin have to find some other way to show that something positive is happening in Russian external affairs. So they decide to put pressure on Belarus and force Belarus to join the war, but Lukashenko resists. And this is kind of in a sense, a slap in the face to the Kremlin. So the decision then in Russia is to conspire against Minsk, to conspire against Lukashenko in particular, and this ends up in what we have foreseen as a failed coup d'etat. So this is our black swan event. Basically, because of Russian frustration over Lukashenko's refusal to enter the war, there is a secret order from the Kremlin, from Putin himself, to have a coup d'état in Minsk. It's carried out by an obscure, previously unknown group, and which allows Russia to have plausible deniability in case something does go wrong. And in this case, it did go wrong. There is a certain intelligence that's intercepted within the elite of the Lukashenko's elite, and the Kremlin underestimates or overestimates its ability to have such influence. So that is this minus that we see. So basically, in this scenario, then Lukashenko becomes more paranoid, both towards the West, but also now towards Moscow. He reinstates the non-nuclear status of Belarus, promises his people that Russian forces will be removed from the territory of Belarus by the end of the year, which has not happened yet. And it also leads to a slight opening in Belarusian and Ukrainian relations, which I will talk about in a moment. So if we look at the political situation, it's rather unstable as a result of these developments. There is an unwritten level of power sharing between the elite on the one hand, who are very paranoid, and then the security services on the other, who are still mostly pro-Russian, despite the failed coup. The society is being repressed. There is no change in attitudes towards society. There is a slight improvement of legitimacy towards Lukashenko because he managed to keep the country out of the war. If we look at the democratic forces in exile, they remain outside the country. They have rather, unfortunately, still little influence of what's happening inside. Also because of this somewhat renewed legitimacy that Lukashenko has gotten for his maneuvers. But in terms of relations between Belarus and Russia, they are very much under stress. We know that Putin now despises Lukashenko for not entering the war and for surviving this coup. But at the same time, both sides know that there has to be some level of dependence on each other. And finally, I think what's important here, we see that because Lukashenko kept Belarus outside the war, this is seen in Kyiv as a sort of new opening, and President Zelensky tries to see it as a possibility to draw Belarus outside the Russian sphere of influence, probably overestimating this at the same time. But there are some early discussions that start taking place at the end of the year regarding demilitarization of the border between the two countries, demining. Of course, no concrete actions have been taken, but some possible steps in that direction. Lastly, and then this is my last words, just in terms of EU, the EU takes a very much a wait and see approach. They're very skeptical of what's taking place in Minsk, but at the same time, thanks to some intervention by Ukraine, they do ease a little bit of the enforcement in terms of sanctions. But we have just divided approach in terms of the EU is not certain how to address what's happening in Belarus, and we'll see what happens in 2024 and beyond. So that's the development. That's this scenario. Again, very difficult one to develop, and we see that Russia is unable to maintain pressure. At the same time, Belarus is not really able to change anything in a very positive direction.
Thank you so much, Adam, for bringing it all together. It was actually difficult for all the groups to develop the fantasies that will bring us to the extreme pluses and minuses by the end of the year. But of course, our task was also to make these scenarios as realistic as possible by checking it hundreds of times if it's still plausible what we have written there. So it would be also interesting to hear the reaction from the public afterwards. Adam mentioned a very important insight that we come to later is the possible increase of legitimacy of Lukashenko. And also you had a black swan connected to the possible participation of Belarus in the war against Ukraine. So in this scenario, sovereignty by default, Lukashenko refuses to do it. In the next scenario, actually, or in the scenario that comes after that, it actually it is the opposite. So he cannot resist, and no, it's actually the other way. Well, the Belarusian army enters the war, but the Lukashenko, so to say, is being removed in this scenario. So it's very interesting to have both of them as a comparison. Our next scenario is named, just a second, I'll come back to the picture, is named Big Biologue. So theoretically seen, this is the best combination, possible combination in our scenario matrix. The best in terms of Belarusian sovereignty. We have the lowest pressure on Belarus coming from Russia, and at the same time, the high level of resilience of the Belarusian society, which would mean that authorities are somehow ready to cooperate with the broad society and civil society. What is interesting that our poor expert group needed even 3 black swans to come to this positive scenario. So we're really eager to hear more about it. Dear Jakob, we ask Jakob Willenstein, who is director of the Belarus office of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, to present your scenario within 5 minutes. Thank you.
Oh, 5 minutes. Yes, I need to start my watch. So thank you, Olga. Thank you, dear colleagues, for this opportunity to speak to you. Indeed, as you've said, this scenario is, from a normative point of view, if you are in favor of a strong, democratic, sovereign Belarus, the most positive one. Still, within the framework which we've given ourselves, it might not be as much as some people might hope for. But as you said, for the negative effect, which we saw compared to the last scenario paper, also positive events could happen that go beyond the given framework. So also, indeed, since the worst scenario did not need a black swan, we have a black swan swarm, basically, 3 of them coming in. But the point is that this scenario could actually also be called the big BY boomerang, since the pressure goes very much up. So both in this matrix, both arrows in the beginning go the opposite way, but they overstretch themselves and then fall back to the other opposite. How does it go? Basically, the scenario starts in a similar way as the one that Adam has pointed out, that the Ukrainian army. Ich kann nicht, mein Schatz. Kommst du bitte später? Machst du die Tür zu und gehst raus, bitte? Jetzt kann ich nicht. I have a visitor. Später. Bitte geh raus. So the Ukrainian army is very successful as even starting to take back Crimea. And this takes Putin to a very difficult situation where he needs to make a choice what to use. He doesn't have a lot of reserves left, and he decides not to use tactical nuclear weapons. Could I have 5 seconds? Working from home is a miracle. So where were we? That's exactly. Putin does not use nuclear weapons, but decides to pressure on Lukashenko. And then he travels to Russia and comes back being sick. Maybe you have heard about this. So there is a coup d'etat, which is not left to chance, but he gets sick in a way that he doesn't die, but he's taken out of the picture. He cannot exert the rule. So the power is taken over by the Prime Minister, Halochenko, and the Security Council member, Mr. Valfovich, and they decide to bring the Belarusian army to the battlefield, which do not change the tide of war, rather than just being destroyed in the battlefield. And Russia still losing on that end, but while Ukraine starts even shelling targets in Belarus. So there's a big escalation, which leads to the next step, that there's uprisings in ethnically non-Russian areas of the Russian Federation, and a split in, or a struggle of power within Russia, which leads to the point that Russia does not decide not to be interested in Belarus, but is basically tied down with keeping stability of, or what is left of it, inside, while there is a second basically coup d'etat happening in Belarus. So power was taken from Lukashenko, and then it is taken again after this horrible defeat and thousands of Belarusian soldiers coming back home in coffins. Power is taken again from these 2 gentlemen by a group which we had discussed with names during the process, but we decided not to give any name tags at this point. So power is taken by a more pragmatic group of patriots who decide to preserve the country and start a national dialogue as an instrument to keep society together, because there's also uprisings, not with mass demonstration, but protests happening in Belarus. The democratic forces call on those protests and strikes. And so a new pragmatic group of people that still is a continuation of the regime takes things in their own hands and start this dialogue, which is still a limited dialogue. So not a full-fledged national dialogue, but with a selected group of stakeholders in the country, which is also a reason why the Russians choose not to interfere, because they think it's a controlled process, which is something they can allow to happen. Some points on the areas of application. So political situation and stability of the regime. The regime is very much destabilized by this double coup and the disaster of sending in the army. That's why those patriots, pragmatic group of patriots from within the ranks of the regime decide to have this controlled national dialogue. Civil society is very much against the entry of the army and partly mobilizes, not as big as in 2020 because structures are destroyed, but parts of the exiled civil society return, and some of them even participate in the process, but mostly focus of this national dialogue, but mostly focus on rehabilitation of political prisoners and reform proposals. Democratic forces in exile are split. Some are more radical and call for protest and resistance action within the country, so partisan action. Others only call for peaceful protests. And the regime, actually, those pragmatic patriots, use that to say they handpick whom to talk to, while saying the others are terrorists, and manage to successfully split the democratic forces into good ones and bad ones, which they handpick. Belarus-Russia relations break down because of the forced entry into the war, but still the Belarusian pragmatists understand they cannot break fully with Russia, but continue with good prosa. Belarus-Ukraine relations had an all-time low when the army enters the war, but after this process is started of this national dialogue, there are some pragmatic steps for having security talks. And last sentence, Belarus-EU relations. I forgot to mention that the EU obviously reacts with very strong sanctions, everything they have in the portfolio when Belarus enters the war, full blockade of the border, for example. Those sanctions are partly lifted when this national dialogue starts. The EU is not totally united, but skeptical of the process being controlled, but lift some sanctions to support what they think is a good start.
Wow, it was exactly 5 minutes. Thank you so much, Jakub. Yes. So thank you so much. It was not an easy task to summarize such a wild scenario. I think it's the wildest in the whole scenario group, because we just have half a year, but basically 8 to 6 months, and needed black swans to make it more or less positive in terms of Belarusian sovereignty. I mean, even if we think in terms of not only the end of this year, but what can come after, there are still some developments that could stay realistic, even if we think still short term, but not only by the end of the year. So this was, so to say, a frame for us to think by the end of the year, but at the same time, when you read these scenarios, you could get the feeling that some events could still be realistic after that. Okay, last but not least, we still have one scenario left, which is named Union Against Russia. This is the scenario with 2 pluses, where we have extremely high pressure coming from Russia by the end of the year, but at the same time, also like in the version of Big Dialogue, some attempt of the Belarusian authorities to cooperate with the society. So they choose, so to say, not to cooperate with Russian elites, but to cooperate with the Belarusian society. And I think it was methodologically the most difficult scenario in our group, because I remember that we had to rewrite it 2 or 3 times in order to come to those 2 big pluses by the end of the year. So you might be really interested what brought us there. I would like to ask Artem Schreibman, who is the director of Sense Analytics from Belarus and also part of the scenario group, to introduce this scenario. And dear Artem, you also have 5 minutes for that, please.
Thank you very much, Olga. Yes, in our scenario, there were maximum Russian pressure, but also surprising level of societal and domestic resilience in Belarus. So what triggered this scenario? First of all, Russia, because of its failures on the Ukrainian front, decided to escalate the pressure, or not the pressure, but the preparation towards a forced transition of power in Belarus, with a view to replace Lukashenko by a puppet leader, by a puppet president by 2025, where there will be an electoral campaign in Belarus. And Russia decides to do this by establishing the network of loyalists, but basically sleeping agents among the local bureaucracy, among the various levels of elites, including the economic nomenclatura. And the first black swan arrives there. This plan is uncovered by the Belarusian law enforcement security officers who remain loyal to Lukashenko, not to Russia in this scenario. And they bring to him this report detailing this plan to basically get rid of him. Of course, this makes Lukashenko furious, and he decides to make a geopolitical U-turn without publicly revealing this conspiracy, without publicly explaining what caused this U-turn. He has made up his mind. But then the second black swan arrives, and it helps him to justify what is about to happen in the eyes of the public. In July, when the promised tactical nuclear weapon storage facility in Belarus has been built, has been constructed, due to the carelessness of the Russian personnel, there is an explosion of a gas tanker truck, not of the nuclear weapon, for God's sake, but this still causes casualties and technical damage to the constructed storage facility. Lukashenko used this accident to point to the threats coming from the further engagement in the Russian military effort. He denounces closer cooperation with Russia and its military, and also puts on hold the deployment of Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus. This all happens in July. In August, he privately, behind the curtain, he appeals to the West for financial support and asks to lift sanctions because he anticipates that his possible U-turn will cause a lot of frustration in Moscow. The West, of course, demands him to release political prisoners and starts a national dialogue and stop supporting the Russian army, including the training exercises and training of Russian mobilized troops. In September, Lukashenko decides to actually give in, at least partly. He releases many political prisoners, including the Nobel Prize winner Ales Bialiatski. He does not release the leaders of the opposition yet, not to destabilize the regime. But he also agrees to put on hold any kind of training for Russian troops. So as a result, some Western sanctions are indeed lifted in November in order to facilitate this opening in Belarus. And with the agreement of the parts of the Belarusian Democratic Forces, a round table between them and the regime with the mediation of the European Union is scheduled for the beginning of 2024. Naturally, Russia by that time realizes that something is going on which requires its counter-reaction, and it starts trade wars against Belarus, that spends its loans and threatens to significantly cut off gas and oil supplies to Belarus in the next year. That's where our timeline of very turbulent year ends. Now, brief couple of words on the areas of application. How does this scenario manifest itself in various areas of life? Belarusian regime is being cleansed of potential pro-Russian agents. They are being quietly persecuted and removed. And the loyal part of the regime, including the security in this scenario, prepares to become part of the state-controlled national dialogue in the next year. Civil society is due to the hold of repression in the country, civil society is able to somewhat restore their operations and communication channels with target groups within the country. However, their actions in Belarus by the end of the year are still very fragmented because they are very suspicious and they try to understand what are the limits of this new opening. Of course, there have been many unsuccessful attempts in the past. Democratic forces in exile are partly divided, but the United Transitional Cabinet, agrees through a dialogue for a dialogue with Lukashenko and his representatives in 2024, but insists that the new election will be the aim of this process. They also ask EU and support the EU in gradually lifting sanctions in exchange for these first concessions by Lukashenko, just to support this process and to motivate him to continue. In Belarusian-Russian relations, of course, Moscow is very much afraid to lose an ally. However, it does not react militarily immediately. It is busy in Ukraine. And at the same time, it realizes the deep economic dependence of Belarus. So it decided to regain control over Belarus, but using economic blackmailing, trade wars, cutting down transit of Belarusian potash via Russian railroads, and so on and so forth. However, secretly, Russian government, of course, develops plans to force Belarus into obedience with the use of military force in some midterm future if the situation completely gets out of control. In relationship with Ukraine, President Zelensky welcomes the developments because that's what Ukraine has been hoping for now months. And he agrees to even resume some trade with Belarus that was on hold because of the war, especially after Lukashenko announces that he will stop training Russian mobilized in his country. In relationship between the Belarus and the EU, finally, there is some opening, some thaw, because some EU sanctions are lifted in anticipation of Russian economic blockade. This includes sanctions against Belarus, sanctions against cargo carriers, potash, timber, but also exports of metals, and several Belarusian banks are de-SWIFTed. And these sanctions are suspended in November because everybody expects that in January, the full wave of Russian economic pressure will start. Economic plan for Belarus for a future is being viewed as of now as a distinct possibility only after the national dialogue and new elections are complete. That's where we are. This scenario also is probably not the likeliest one at this stage, and we understand that several black swans were needed for it to materialize. But I hope you notice that in this scenario, all events triggered one another. So it was in a way, maximum resiliency inside the country was the reaction to the maximum pressure exerted by Russia. I'll stop here and thank you.
Thank you so much, Artem, also for making this correlation visible at the end, since it's also a good bridge, so to say, to our next part of discussion, which is the summary of the so-called insights, which means the some interesting ideas, correlations, chances and risks for the Belarusian sovereignty that were distilled out from the scenarios that experts methodologically gathered together and divided them into groups, so to say. And I'll just take some of them, which seem to me to be most important or most interesting. And actually this part in our scenario paper, this part which is called Insights, Chances and Risks, this is actually something that also will stay relevant after we see that maybe most of the scenarios or none of them will become reality, because those correlations and interdependencies will most probably stay. So it's very important now to understand what we're dealing with in terms of correlations within the political system in Belarus, but also so to say, in foreign policy, in relations with other states and democratic forces and so on. So we'll start with one main insight, which means, and we already mentioned it, that prolongation of the status quo, which means that there are no black swans, just as in the first scenario where Belarus becomes Russian protectorate, can lead us to an increase in dependence from Russia and thus to the loss of the significant elements of Belarusian sovereignty. Then we have quite a number of insights concerning the regime of Belarus, the Belarusian regime. The first one is a very short one. Lukashenko's regime in Belarus is not stable, at least according to our scenarios. And this is something that maybe politicians take for granted, but as our scenario showed, some certain developments can make it unstable very fast. The next one, concerning reaction of Lukashenko regime to Russia's pressure, is really not predictable. And you see that this pressure has very different consequences in different scenarios. So it might lead both to de facto annexation of Belarus, but at the same time, as in the last scenario, to a national or to an attempt of a national dialogue in Belarus with between authorities and society. Concerning Russian influence in Belarus, it might not necessarily be visible to all, and here we come to the last scenario as well presented by Artyom. So there might be already some underground pro-Russian network operating in the regions, and it could be also a very powerful tool and not visible tool of influence, Russian tool of influence in Belarus. Also, the regional elites, it's also from this scenario, might be interested in cooperation with Russia in hope of decentralization via the integration process between Belarus and Russia. The legitimacy of Lukashenko as Belarus may increase. I think it was already mentioned by one of the experts. If he is, for example, still, if he proceeds with keeping Belarus out of the war or survives a Russian organized coup, and the last one here in the regime, and overstrained Russia, weakened by the Western sanctions and maybe also militarily weakened in Ukraine, could become unattractive even to the representatives of the Belarusian elites and to large parts of Belarusian society. So connection to Russia is also not something that is self-understandable and not changeable. Then we come to some insights on the Belarusian democratic forces. The first one is that the readiness of the Lukashenko regime, according to our scenarios, could kind of split the democratic forces into at least two groups, maybe even more, but we could have a moderate group which would be ready to talk to him, and a more radical group, so to say, which would deny any contacts with the Lukashenko system, with the Lukashenko regime. And at the same time, the national dialogue in Belarus would not necessarily be an inclusive one, and we see it also on the example of two scenarios where only moderate representatives of democratic forces are invited, or dialogue turns out to be an imitation. Finally, some insights on the war. Of course, it was a very important factor in our scenarios, as I already guessed. Actually, all experts of all scenario groups needed positive military developments for Ukraine, not for Russia, to come both to a plus and to a minus at the end. What does it mean? It means that military defeat of Russia in Ukraine does not guarantee a positive scenario for the Belarusian sovereignty, because Russia might want to annex Belarus as a sort of compensation for losing Ukraine, right? But at the same time, such a defeat might ease off its pressure on Belarus, because Russia might become not able to exert pressure on Belarus, might lack resources, might be too much under military pressure. And at the same time, this would mean that also for the Belarusian elites, such an overstretched Russia would become less attractive. Weakened Russia would become less attractive. And also Belarus entering the war against Ukraine can cause very different consequences. As you've heard of our scenarios, it could come to a fragmentation of Belarusian elites, like to a real fragmentation. It could even change the regime, and it could start any kind of a national dialogue as well. The last one on the EU will most probably not be able to speak with one voice if Lukashenko suddenly opens up to the West. The experts were not sure how the EU would react. The EU might be divided and reluctant to get involved. So much to our insights. You will find many more of them in the paper. Please have a look. I'm not sure if I already mentioned it. The paper is already published on our website, netforbelarus.org, and we will send the link to all the participants after the discussion is ended. So now we'll come to the last part of our discussion before we open the floor to the questions from public. We wanted also, so to say, not only to have this fantasy exercise, but also to make it more specific for decision makers. So we made some policy recommendations to different policy actors. And the experts decided about one wished option or wished scenario by the end of the year, or actually even after that Belarus sovereignty is restored at least no further elements of it are lost compared to the status quo, to what we have today. So this is our wished option or scenario, and experts decided that we needed to reach at least 3 goals to come to this wished option. The first goal is that there is no further integration with Russia, and Belarusian government makes independent decisions, political decisions. The second one is Belarus is diversified, has a diversified access to economic, financial, and diplomatic resources. And the third one is there is a basic consensus between the government and the people in Belarus, including parts of civil society, about the political course of the country. So these are our main goals to reach, to contribute to the preservation of Belarusian sovereignty, and our experts elaborated some policy recommendations. We'll start with the recommendations to the European Union and Western actors, and I would like to ask Jakob to do that. Dear Jakob, you would have 3 to 4 minutes. Please try to be as short as possible and choose only the most important ones. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. I think what you already mentioned, Olga, is the framework for everything that is the consensus recommendations for the West. I think for the West, we also included Ukraine in this paper, that what the West can do to safeguard Belarusian sovereignty is actually limited. Therefore, I would say it comes down to a very simple sentence in 4 words: ready when you are. So that the Western camp, the Western community should signal to the Belarusians very broadly that they are ready to be an alternative for Belarus to turn to when Russia is taken out of the picture as a factor, or at least the capability of exerting the influence that the Russians, as we agreed in this framework, will still want to exert, will be limited. So that should start with the perception of Belarus. The question, do Western decision makers and experts actually perceive Belarus as part of the broad picture to bring stability and peace to Eastern Europe? Is this something which comes after solving Ukraine or solving Russia, or is it something which is seen as part of the same picture simultaneously? Maybe the levers at the moment are limited towards Belarus, but is it our understanding that a stable, sovereign, democratic Belarus that is also strong is in our strategic interest and the strategic interest of the partners in the region? So developing a more strategic approach towards Belarus together with the Belarusians, and making sure that we connect our interests, the interest of the European Union, of the Western camp, of the states neighboring Belarus and Ukraine, that our interest actually coincides with the interest of Belarusians to, again, have a sovereign, strong, democratic Belarus. So perception is what matters. Then prepare for the eventualities. We have worked out a scenario paper, and I think it is very advisable for decision makers in European capitals to also have scenarios ready to be able to step up to be there for Belarus when the opportunity comes, which might go faster than expected. That's what scenarios show. Black swans can appear. And if, again, Russia is significantly weakened, the question is, will the elites in Belarus looking towards the West actually see a valid alternative? Are we ready to provide this? So do we have a strategy, an economic plan, a support plan, contingency plans that can be activated very quickly in the economic field, in the field of energy supplies? That could be something. Imagine the scenario which we had: Russia is weakened, but still might control the gas and oil flows to Belarus. So they could say, we don't actually interfere and stop a democratic, or the beginning of a democratic transition, or even a national dialogue, but we just say we shut off energy supplies to you, so any democratic experiment will be stopped because the lights go off. So would the European Union be capable of stepping up? And I think one point was also to even support a process if it starts, by being a mediation platform maybe, or sending experts that could consult. So are we actually prepared? And then second very important point, how do we communicate this? Do we actually want Belarusians in different spheres, different groups within the country, not only those in exile, but those in the country, to hear that the West can be an alternative if Belarusians themselves want this to happen? So do we talk to the elites? Do we have tailor-made approaches of communication to business, to decision makers, maybe even the security forces, saying we are an alternative, again, if you want to? Perceptions of Belarusians matter. Do Belarusians see us? And those Belarusians who are living in European EU countries, do they feel being welcomed already? So that was one idea, having a green card system for those who want to come and live here for the time being. And last but not least, support Ukraine. We saw all the 4 scenarios. Have a scenario where Ukraine is victorious on the battlefield. Maybe it's a bit of a weakness of the scenario paper that we did not have a single scenario where Ukraine is defeated, but maybe that's also a big takeaway, that we didn't see this as a possible option. But supporting Ukraine, therefore, as a takeaway, is one common takeaway from the scenarios.
Thank you so much, Jakob. And I definitely do not see it as a weakness of this paper, so to say, because actually, I think in such a way we can show that even a positive development in Ukraine can still bring us to the negative developments in Belarus, while at the same time, the negative developments in Ukraine is automatically, so to say, a negative also for Belarus, for its sovereignty, for its democracy. I will allow myself a very short question to you, Jakob, because I see that one of our first recommendations is to follow a double track of contact, both with democratic forces and with the representatives of the Belarusian regime. And I know that this recommendation is not very popular within the democratic forces or expert circles. Maybe you could comment it just within 2-3 sentences shortly.
I mean, if you look at what is happening now, there are de facto conversations. Still, some EU embassies are working in Belarus and did not decide to shut down completely. Some don't have ambassadors now, but still chargé d'affaires are working. So keeping open communication channels for the time being, that imagine something was to change quickly and you need to talk to someone, then it is important to have those telephone numbers and actually make sure somebody picks up. It was not the point to increase recognition or to have new ambassadors sent. At least that's what I remember from the conversations, but just to maintain and not give away without any pressure what we still have in terms of communication channels.
Thank you, Jakob. Okay, we'll now proceed with the Belarusian democratic forces, who are, of course, also very important actors. So there are also recommendations to this group of decision makers, and I would like to ask Artyom to comment on that.
Yes, supporting what Jakob has said, the Western leverage and ability to influence the scale and the size of Belarusian sovereignty, so to say, is very limited. In case of the democratic forces, it is arguably even more limited. And that is why our recommendation to the democratic forces, most of them concern the good scenarios, or let's say preparing for the good scenarios of windows opening for national dialogue and of Russia becoming less of a blocker of all the positive developments in the country. So for the first goal, which Olga has outlined, there is no further integration with Russia. I think what democratic forces can do is to remind everybody in Europe, in the West, in the world, that Belarus is still a sovereign country, which is, of course, an authoritarian regime deeply connected to Russia. However, the positive perception of the country whose sovereignty needs to be protected as a value to everybody needs to be promoted. Belarusian democratic forces and civil society should also continue projects on strengthening the Belarusian identity within the country. And it also, I mean, to achieve this grand goal of not allowing further erosion of Belarusian sovereignty, the democratic forces can work together with the EU, with the expert community, on the proposals for the new EU-Belarusian partnership when the time allows, when the conditions allows, so that when it actually happens, there is a prepared blueprint of how we move forward quickly and restore what needs to be restored in Belarusian Western relationship. On the second goal, whereas Belarus is resilient economically, basically, where it has diversified access to economic, financial, and diplomatic resources as much as possible, and when it becomes possible. What we thought of is the possible development of the Green Pass system for the Belarusian businesses, for unsanctioned Belarusian businesses, and Belarusian democratic forces can play a role here. They can vet Belarusian businesses or consult the EU structures on who deserves this Green Pass to work in the EU without various obstacles and bureaucratic barriers which they currently face. And they also need to think in the long term. What would need to happen when the time comes, when maybe there is some opening in the Belarusian regime, where what needs to be done quickly to reduce the economic dependency of Russia on Belarus? What needs to be done from Belarusian authorities themselves, maybe future Belarusian authorities, but also what needs to be done by the West. How this dependence can be reduced, because this is a matter of the country's sovereignty and its resilience. And thirdly, to foster the basic consensus between the at least parts of government and the people on the issue of sovereignty. I think that, and we think that it is very important to prime the issue of sovereignty in the agenda of the democratic forces. So not just focusing on the quick change of the Belarusian regime, which is increasingly unlikely, but also prime sovereignty as an issue, which might lay some groundwork for at least some communication, maybe future communication, or at least understanding with parts of the Belarusian ruling elite for whom sovereignty is still a value, maybe during the transition period. And this might actually be a uniting point in future Belarus, where both some segments of the current regime and obviously all segments of the democratic forces are caring deeply about the country's sovereignty. So there need to be communication strategies for Belarusians inside the country who are not on the same page with the democratic forces on all the other issues, who are not pro-democratic, who are maybe somewhat pro-Russian, but communication strategies should be developed also vis-a-vis them to send the signal that there is one common value that unites us. We all would like to be in the sovereign country, and this needs to be our future common denominator, if you will. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Artyom. Just wanted to mention it was really a big challenge, of course, to find a compromise for these policy recommendations, as we had 15 experts from different countries, also from different views on the situation in Belarus and what has been done. And really, my huge thanks goes to all of the experts. That I think we really have a good result here, and we managed to somehow unite different ideas under the focus of preserving the Belarusian sovereignty. So I'll proceed with further recommendations to international donor organizations, maybe further international actors, and what we have not mentioned yet, I think also the Belarusian civil society and diaspora. I would like to ask Tatiana to do it. Tatiana, if you could, please try to do it within actually 3 minutes only, because we're about over the time to let our discussion still happen until 18 o'clock. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. You left for me, many actors and least time for recommendations, but I'll do my best. We actually have one more actor within our recommendation, and this is pro-independence members of the Belarusian regime. And we have one recommendation for them, and it's actually about sabotage. So we recommend whenever and wherever it's possible to sabotage or to subvert Russia's efforts to put Belarus under Kremlin control. I think it's an important recommendation and it should be mentioned. We also have some recommendations towards Ukraine and Ukrainian government. And I think it's important and maybe it's time to harmonize foreign policy of Ukraine towards Belarusian democratic forces and Belarusian regime with the EU and other democratic countries' approaches. So basically, it would be very good to cooperate with Belarusian democratic forces as representatives of pro-democratic Belarusians, but also to follow this, general narratives and general lines which exist in EU and other Western democratic countries' policies towards Belarus. We also have, I think, very interesting and important recommendations for Belarusian independent media, but also expert and academic community, not only Belarusians, but also for international. And we think that research on this integration process of the threats on sovereignty, on cooperation between government and civil society, if it is still possible, all these topics, and of course, resilience of society, all these topics should be developed. There must be more policy papers, and there must be more webinars like we are having right now. And when it comes to recommendations to international donors, we think that it's essential to support, of course, civil society and media, mass media, as they do now. But at the same time, it's also important to support all these researchers which we are mentioning now, and to support those expert communities and expert groups who do this research and who present them to the public. The last but not the least, we also think this part of us that it's essential to support democratic forces themselves, because from our point of view, now there is a kind of a disbalance or misbalance between the support which is provided to civil society, media, and Belarusian democratic community, and Belarusian democratic forces. And at the same time, we should understand, and we know the cases that those people who are affiliated with Belarusian democratic forces, they are really in high security risks. So I think it's also like timely to continue support to civil society, media, and research, and other these developments which are essential for understanding the situation in Belarus. But it's also important to support those who are like making these democratic developments and produce alternative agenda for Belarus. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was also perfectly within 3 minutes. So last but not least, dear Adam, you already heard all recommendations. We have some more of them. So I'll just leave it to you to decide what has not been mentioned yet, what you consider to be important.
Thank you, Olga. I will be very brief. I think maybe to highlight and kind of conclude our whole discussion as a result of this exercise, I think it's important to just explain that these scenarios are meant for us to understand how developments could happen in Belarus. But of course, we have to keep in mind that these scenarios may not happen at all. But also that, as the black swans show, that anything is truly possible. Even just in the last few years, so many unpredictable events in our region and in the world just show how difficult it is for us to understand what could happen. Even the likely hospitalization of Lukashenko that we've heard recently, just shows that we have to be prepared for anything and expect the unexpected. So that's really a bit of the logic that's behind the scenarios and the black swans in the scenarios. And I think that when we talk about the recommendations and the exercise that we've gone through to develop these scenarios, the recommendations are much more broader than just the scenarios themselves. So we have to keep in mind that these recommendations are really for the policymakers, to help us promote in some way, as much of a sovereign Belarus as possible, because we should understand at least that the scenario where Russia, in essence, annexes Belarus, this would be significantly bad for Europe. It certainly would escalate the already unprecedented security situation that we have, but also would have an enormous impact on the social situation in the country, as we've been talking about over the last hour or so. So I think these goals and recommendations that we presented here, as we've already discussed, are sometimes difficult or even controversial. But we do have to believe that we do believe as experts that we can provide some roadmaps for policymakers to have this impact, to promote Belarusian sovereignty and hopefully maybe get it on the road towards becoming a much more democratic state. And I think that's what the experts here also want to point out is that, and I think was already mentioned just in this last discussion, that we cannot forget about Belarus. It is not just cannot be just put together in this basket as the same as Russia. It would be unwise for us to write off Belarus. Certainly, it's under pressure and it's under a lot of Kremlin influence. But I think paying attention and creating a cohesive policy is important overall for the region. So finally, I think, and lastly, what's extremely important to emphasize here, and what we've learned throughout this process of building the scenarios, we as groups, we did not consult together. So each of these scenarios were developed separately. But what's really important, what came out here, is that the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine, will certainly have a huge impact on the situation in Belarus. So we cannot separate those, the future of Belarus and the situation with the war. We cannot separate that at all. We don't know how it's going to develop, but at least these scenarios give us an opportunity to try to imagine some possible paths that we should be prepared for.
Thank you so much, Adam, for this really good closing remark. And now I would like to open the discussion. We will have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions from the audience. This would be possible if people who are in Zoom now raise their hands, and then you would be given the opportunity to ask your question or give a comment with a voice. And I also invite other experts from the scenarios to make any remarks if you would like to. I know that you already that you've also registered. So as far as I know, we don't have the Q&A session with the comments, so please raise your hand so that we know who would like to ask the question so that we could give you the possibility to speak. Okay, so now we have several hands already. The first I would like to give to Kai Feller, then to Gesine Dornblut.
Yes, thank you very much. So there are some rumors that...
Sorry, I forgot to say it. Could you please introduce yourself also before asking the question?
My name is Kai Feller. I'm a pastor for ecumenical relations in northern Germany. So there are some rumors that Lukashenko disappeared on a holiday. And so are you prepared for the case he would have a disease and then not come home from hospital, or he would even die?
Who is this question to? To all experts? To somebody specific?
Who wants to answer?
Who would like to answer? Okay, I would maybe and give the opportunity to the experts of whoever wants to answer. I mean, this is of course a very speculative question, so.
I can try to maybe separate this question in two. I mean, are we personally ready as a somewhat civil society research community? Well, I'm not sure that anybody can properly prepare to this because no one knows what will follow. In terms of this scenario exercise, I think there have been at least one that foresees the coup, which is of course not the same as Lukashenko disappearing, and two different kind of black swans. But the power vacuum that would exist after, and the need for everybody to recalibrate their strategies to Belarus, I think would be roughly the same. So this is being, a scenario that is close to this was sort of discussed, I think by Jakob it was presented. But generally speaking, because we don't know how exactly this will affect all those drivers and all those developments that we described, we did not include it as a black swan. This is too, if there are degrees of black swans, a sudden death of Lukashenko, which didn't come out of like a coup or some effort to replace him with something, with somebody, I think is the blackest of all swans, because you have many actors who find themselves unprepared and acting very chaotically in the first maybe days, maybe hours after this, so in the most crucial time. That's why honest answer, at least on my side, would be no, nobody is prepared for this.
Thank you, Artyom. Yeah.
Yes, since it was part of our scenario, just to underscore what Artyom says, it depends very much on whether this is part of a planned course of action. Like in our scenario, he was not killed, but he was made so ill by, well, an intentional actor that he was out of the game as an acting president. But even if he was to die suddenly out of anything that is not intentional, there are procedures in place, right? Who would supplant him? And then, to my understanding, that's the collective president by his own decree, since he didn't want to trust that on one single individual. So that would be a procedure in place to guarantee a regime continuity. I think the question would then be, what would happen from that point until elections? Would there be a struggle of power? How strongly would the Russians be able to present their own candidate or their own group of people? So there's many open questions.
Yeah, may I just briefly? Yeah, as far as we know, like Belarusian political system is a highly highly vertical system. So we see that there is one leader, and it's really centered. So it's really like leadership centered. So when there is no this leader, there might be like a lot of anxieties, and it's now actually we saw a lot of comments when he just disappeared for several days. And there was definitely a kind of, like worries among the environment of Lukashenko and those who are with him. So my prediction is that, of course, if something like this happens, it will like kind of unbalance the whole political system. But I will totally support Artyom here that like nobody is like 100% prepared. I mean, there are some ideas, there are maybe some even speculations, but no, really, I mean, there are a lot of factors which we can't predict at all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Tatiana. Then I will give the word to Gesine Dornblut.
Hi, thank you very much. Gesine Dornblut. I'm a journalist working with Deutschlandfunk, Nationwide Public Radio. Actually, I had the same question or a similar question like Kai Feller. And I will now concentrate on the question, the hospitalization or alleged hospitalization of Lukashenko. And I recently, just half or 1 hour again, I saw that a photo was published with his picture. So maybe he appeared again in publicly. But my question would be, if he really is hospitalized, what chances does that open for the democratic opposition and democratic parts of Belarusian society?
Thank you, Gesine. Who would like to give the first comment?
I will start, and maybe colleagues will support me. I mean, it will. I mean, if he's like ill in a very serious way, of course, it will create a kind of existential crisis for the whole Belarusian system. And it will, on the one hand, it might open windows of opportunities for all democratic actors, and they may act. On the other hand, on other extreme, of course, it will open also window of opportunity for those, I mean, hardliners within Belarusian system, or for those who are, pro-Russian, I mean, really pro-Russian within Belarusian system. So here we will, in this situation, I think that we can get, I mean, these two extremes. I mean, like opportunity to have a very positive scenario of democratic transition. However, I mean, realistically thinking, I'm afraid that we will have scenario of much more complicated path of hardliners from Belarusian system and from pro-Russia side.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, I think, Tatiana, you said it in the previous question that, you have the system is a vertical system. And if you take out the top, will it just collapse, or, it will open up a vacuum. And there will be many, I think, forces trying to vie for power. And who is the most strongest, is I think the question that the analysts are looking at right now. And obviously the security services, which are largely backed by Russia or are pro-Russian themselves, will, as Tatiana said, I would just repeat what she said, that there will definitely be, I think, for them, they will see it as a window of opportunity. So certainly democratic forces are already hinting at this possible window of opportunity, but they're not the only ones who are trying to get through that window.
Thank you, Adam. Any other comments before we come to the next question? Jakob?
Yeah, just two little remarks. One being that obviously the democratic forces, or anyone who aspires for democratic changes in Belarus, is in an even worse position than they were in 2020, just because all structures have been destroyed so systematically. And even in 2020, problem was that there was a little degree of organization, in contrast to Maidan in Kiev, where you had political parties and unions and all those organized structures that were able to channel voices of public interest. And now those are gone. And if you look at who has organizational power in the country, those are the security forces, the Russian state companies maybe, but also newly created structures being under creation, Belarus as a political organization being transformed into a party. So for democratic forces in exile, even to return home, it seems like there would have to be some preliminary agreement with someone to represent their points of view in Minsk, even for all those decrees on terrorist lists or lists of extremists, or those verdicts that many of the exiled opposition leaders would face 10, 15 years of prison into the country again. So in order for those who are exiled to return, you would have to see somebody arise in the system, or from within Belarus at least, to negotiate a first step. But I also wanted just to say, for Dornbluth, I just finished reading your book and I thought it was excellent about the Russian society. I think this is very much underappreciated. High recommendation in German.
Okay, that's wonderful. We already have some synergy effects during our discussion.
Sorry, Olga, may I just add like two
Sure.
words? I mean, I can't totally agree with Jakob about the state of society, because on the one hand, indeed, I mean, organized civil society and all civil society structures are being destroyed, but there are still some. I mean, they have not been destroyed totally on the one hand. On the other hand, we also have this so-called solidarity networks. I mean, people are still united. I mean, maybe not in organized way, but in this solidarity spirit. So I can't support this, very hard statement that there is nothing inside the country. There is something, but it's not. I mean, it's not like organized civil society as it used to be. However, we also saw from 2020 that like organized civil society were not the main drivers of the protest. I mean, it's just, I mean, not to be too, too categoric or to be too straight when we are making such statements about the state of society inside the country.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Tatiana. I've just received information that we now do have the opportunity to ask the question also in the Q&A session. If you are somehow, if you don't have the opportunity to switch on your voice, please leave your questions or comments also here. We will read them. We still have one more hand, if I'm not mistaken, from Michael from Rekultur. Yes, now?
Do you hear me?
Yes, now you will hear.
All right, yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm representing a Danish NGO that works for democracy in Belarus. And I would first of all like to thank you for the very interesting work you have done. And I have printed out your report already, and I will read the 30 pages and also the 4 scenarios. Today we have heard much about democratic forces and how academic and experts, journalists should be supported. And I think that we are overlooking the part of civil society that is necessary to strengthen if Belarus should gain and sustain democracy. My point is that no matter which scenario that will appear, there is a need to be developed strong, healthy parties in Belarus that can educate members to. They need to be elected in seats and stuff if there will be a democracy, and if that work is not and if support is not directed in this direction, I think there will be a very shaky democracy if it ever appears, and that it could easily be targeted under threat from Russia. I think that and this is perhaps something that Jakob Wallenstein talked about today. I think that the European Union should not just prepare to step up. They should actually step up now and support development of democratic parties that already exist now. And today this support is something that you will gain in a big competition with all other kinds of NGOs, from football clubs to journalists. So therefore, it's very hard to develop these parties. So I think that you should have a further recommendation there, Jakob. And I also think that there could be a recommendation for the Belarusian civil society. You need to become members of a political party, because parties are those clubs where you become members in if you want really to change societies. That's a big lesson of European countries and how we gain democracy in European countries. And I think we are all looking this. I'm the first one who's actually, I think, said the word party today. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward for the comments.
Thank you very much. I think we could divide also this question or comment into two parts. So you've been talking about political parties in Belarus and also about what the European Union can do now in order not, so to say, only to be prepared for the day X in Belarus. So who would like to comment on the first part or on the second part? Just raise your hand or just speak. Jakob?
Yeah, thank you. Since my name was mentioned, I mean, I think it's not the task of Westerners to develop parties. That's definitely the task for the Belarusians themselves. What Western partners can do is show examples of how parties are being organized. I think your hand has been up again because you didn't mean that. So supporting them or giving them access to understanding how parties function, how different party systems function in European countries or Western countries. I mean, we have very different examples ourselves, how parties function. In some countries, parties have a very, very strong role. In others, in Belarus, traditionally, parties have not played a huge role in forming the political, or not a role at all at forming the actual political will, because it was there were no free elections, but there were political parties all the time that did play a role in articulating the democratic ideas, and there are connections with these parties. For example, with the European People's Party, there are several parties that have an observer status, and there's close cooperation happening. So that is an issue, but also there are ongoing conversations among the Belarusian forces, the democratic forces, whether some of them should develop into parties or rather not, in order not to overstress competition, because parties compete. To what degree the Belarusian democratic movement should stay a movement that's unified and only have party formation later, after the common goal is achieved, to actually compete in a free and fair election in Belarus. And so that's an ongoing conversation. But I think if you look at statements by several actors and representatives, some already announced that they want to form parties in the future, but others just looking at their statements, how they see models of society, of the economy, you can tell that if they were to be represented in a parliament today, they would also sit in different chairs in different parts of that parliament.
Thank you, Jakob. Any other ideas on the parties? Otherwise, we can come to the second part of the question on the immediate steps by the European Union.
Yeah, otherwise, I could perhaps follow up on this remark. I don't think that we need to run into Belarusian parties to tell them what kind of opinions they do have and such. But we need to recognize that Western parties, they have an economy, and by that economy, they can make seminars, they can run local clubs, they can make conferences, and by all that, they can develop their own parties. We are talking about organizational support. If we don't recognize that, we will have weak parties and weak party members because we forget to support that kind of vital democratic infrastructure.
Okay, Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just have to cut you because we well, it's already 6 o'clock. So thank you once again for your comment. Do we have any reactions on the immediate steps of the European Union, since this was the second part of the question? I actually think that we also mentioned some very short-term steps in our recommendations, but maybe we could summarize them once again so that our guests have them in mind after leaving our Zoom session. Maybe Artyom, as it was part of your your recommendation part as European.
Not really. I was given a presented recommendations for democratic forces.
I have the feeling that we only recommend something to be prepared for.
Well, not only, of course, maintaining contacts with dual track contact, so to say, with some segments of Belarusian regime, but also I think what we could add is already enabling. There is this very popular slogan in the years and decades of European policy vis-a-vis Belarus that we treat regime and the society separately. Well, I think there might be some measures taken in this direction. We recommend some of them in our paper. For example, this green pass for Belarusian businesses that are not sanctioned and have been vetted by democratic forces or joined maybe civil society / European groups, control groups, steps that would show to Belarusians that they are not being lumped together with their regime, because this is currently the most common grievance I hear from pro-democratic Belarusians who feel simply abandoned by the West, who say that basically you just think that we are like the regime, and I mean, why bother? I mean, if you just shut down the borders, don't issue enough visas, complicate the ways in which we can operate our businesses that felt under repressions inside the country, then I mean, it takes a lot of principled ideological motivation to keep being pro-European in Belarus these days. For many, the past 2 or 3 years was a disappointment. So maybe some steps towards this separation, differentiation rather, between regime and the society and the fair, businesses and just ordinary people would be a good first step.
Thank you, Artyom. I think I will take the last question here in the Q&A sessions, as it's already 5 minutes past 6. In the first scenario, do Belarusian forces directly engage in the war in Ukraine? If yes, how do people of Belarus react? Is there any resistance? In case of resistance, could Belarus become that push for resistance that was so needed within Russian people, or it won't change anything? I think we had exactly this, not in the first scenario, but in was it the third one? Jakub, was it your scenario that Belarus enters the war? Maybe you could answer this question. Thank you.
Yeah, because in the first scenario, we didn't have this factor or this idea that Belarusian forces are directly engaged. No.
Yes, in our scenario, there was resistance. There were calls for resistance or to resistance from the democratic forces, but also it came from within. It was not street protests on the same scale as we saw in 2020, but what our scenario foresaw were rather strikes at factories. Not so much reacting to the very fact that the troops entered Ukraine, but coffins, so people dying, Belarusian soldiers dying, and then the war coming home. That was rather seen as the trigger. But again, local protest actions, a spike or a strong increase of partisan actions, as we have seen over the past year and a half, partisan actions against Russian troops moving against railroads. But generally, public sentiment, people being outraged at this, yes, that was the reaction.
Thank you so much, Jakub. I think we will finish here. Dear guests, dear experts, thank you so much for your time and for your interest and for your effort. I will post the link to the policy paper here in chat in Zoom. For those who have not seen it yet or not read it yet, please spread it in your networks. We will also send all of the guests who registered for this webinar a link to our YouTube channel, where we will publish our discussion, also to those who couldn't join us today in YouTube. And of course, also well, maybe to the representatives of the media, if you would need any contacts of our experts at the end of the paper, you will see all the 15 names, all the experts that participated in this work. So if you would need to make some interviews or for other formats, if you would like to get the contacts of the experts, so please write to us. We will make it possible. We will also be presenting this paper to specific target groups this and next week. Those will be closed presentations. If you have the feeling that you also have some specific group that would like this paper to be presented, please give us a sign. Otherwise, just spread it and make it publicly visible, because it has been really hard work. The experts have been working for 3.5 months, and it was extremely difficult, of course, to work on short-term scenarios, taking into consideration the political and military developments in the region. We had to change some developments. For example, the day that we knew that the tactical nuclear weapons were to be placed in Belarus. It happened actually after we already wrote the scenarios. It was really a challenging intellectual task. Once again, our huge thanks goes to all the experts, and thank you to all once again for visiting us today, and have a good evening. Goodbye.
Thank you, Olga. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.